Welcome back to the Scrapbooker to Cardmaker series. Let's talk about ink. You may have already been using some inks with your scrapbooking. If you haven't, they're a wonderful addition. And certainly if you start, when you're card making, if you start stamping, you're going to need to know about inks. If you're just getting started with inks, there are some things that you're going to need, and I'd like to recommend, in some cases, the choice of products, in some cases, some specific products. When you're stamping, naturally you're going to need some neutrals, some black and brown. If you're buying black and brown, I would recommend you go ahead and get a permanent ink. Stays On is one brand of solvent ink. There are others, but a permanent ink will, as the name implies, it's permanent. When you stamp it, of course, when you stamp on paper, most anything is permanent. It's not going to come off, but this will adhere to fabrics and to all kinds of different acetate, all kinds of different surfaces. The reason I would recommend a permanent ink for black or brown is if you ever get into coloring images with watercolor crayons or colored pencils, which you might already have, or markers, which you might already have from your scrapbooking, these inks won't run. And they're a tad more expensive. They do have a special cleaner for cleaning your stamps with Stays On ink, but it's worth it to go ahead and do that rather than buying a different black and a different basic brown, but especially the black, because that's very often, if you're going to color an image, you're going to stamp it in black first. So I would recommend those to you. There's another particular ink that you will probably enjoy having, and that's called Versamark. Versamark is a watermark ink, and I'm going to show you in some of the subsequent videos some projects using this ink. You can stamp an image with Versamark, and it will create a, in fact, let me go ahead and show you some examples of what you can do with Versamark. One of the things you can do is ink up a stamp in Versamark, stamp it on cardstock or even designer paper, and just let it dry. And what this does is it creates a watermark or a tone-on-tone kind of effect. So you get a slightly darker than the base color of cardstock image, which is a very, very nice effect. It's wonderful on the backgrounds of cards. It's great for scrapbook pages, for giving a little extra something to some cardstock. You can also use Versamark for embossing. You can stamp and do the same process, except instead of letting the ink dry, it will stay wet for quite a bit of time. You can sprinkle it with clear embossing powder and heat that up and get an embossed image. You can also use colored embossing powder like this gold. You can use white. Embossing powder comes in lots of different colors. So that's one of the things that you can do with Versamark. There are other things. There are emboss resist things that you can do with Versamark, either with inks or with pastels. So there's lots and lots of things. It's a very, very versatile ink, and as the name implies. So I would definitely recommend the Versamark as one of the options, one of the inks that you might want to invest in. All right. So those are some inks that I would consider as must-haves, a black Stays On and a Versamark ink. Everything else then becomes a matter of preference. If you have been scrapbooking for a while, you may already have some distress inks, and you've probably certainly seen these in a lot of scrapbooking videos. A lot of people use these inks to ink the edges of their papers to give a nice aged look. The three colors of distress ink that I use the most: Vintage Photo and Antique Linen. Antique Linen being a much lighter aging, and the Vintage Photo being brown. And then Old Paper, which is a kind of slightly greenish tint to it, greenish gold tint to it. Those three are, I consider, the must-haves. Distress inks are a dye ink. Dye inks will, in most cases, dry immediately or dry fairly quickly. The distress inks take a little bit longer to dry. They're designed to do that. But they do dry fairly quickly, but you can use them with water to do some different things, and you'll see a lot of demonstrations where people take these distress inks, and they come in colors as well, and they'll ink up a smooth surface like a crafting sheet, spritz some water on them, and then use that as a watercolor that you can dip paper in and do all kinds of neat backgrounds. I talk about that because of their versatility, and also to point out that there are other types of dye ink. Stampin' Up! Makes a dye ink. Their classic inks are dye inks, and they'll be labeled classic. So if you start getting into stamping, this is one of the products that you might consider are Stampin' Up's inks. And if you already have them, they work almost the same way as the Distress inks. They don't stay wet quite as long, so they don't have quite the same properties as the Distress inks, but very close. A lot of the things that you will see people do with the Distress ink, you can do with the Stampin' Up! Ink. So if you have those, give them a try. And if you're wanting to kind of do double duty with something and you like some of the Stampin' Up! Colors, then again, they work very similarly. The River Rock, for example, is very similar to Old Paper in color, and there's a lot of ones that are fairly similar. So, and Stampin' Up! Comes in a really broad color palette, as well as the Distress inks do, but these have papers that match them, markers that match them, and a lot of different things. So you have some options there, but I would definitely recommend some basic Distress inks, and just like you can use the Stampin' Up! Inks for some of the like inking with water and stuff, ink and water combinations like you can with the Distress inks, you can use the Distress inks in the same way you can use the Stampin' Up! Classic inks. In other words, you can stamp with them. So you can take this vintage photo and ink up a stamp and stamp an image very much like you can any other dye ink. So you've got a lot of versatility between those different products. Now, I've mentioned those were dye inks, and how you can tell something is a dye ink is it should be labeled that it's a dye ink, or it should explain it somewhere on the manufacturer's website. But you can also tell by the type of pad that the ink has. It will have a smooth pad that looks like cloth. That's a dye ink, as opposed to a pigment ink. This is a Stampin' Up! Product also. It's their craft version of their inks, and all their inks come in, or all their basic color of ink come in the craft. This has a spongy pad to it. The difference is this ink is a little bit thicker. It takes quite a bit longer to dry, even on paper. So when you stamp something that you've inked up with one of these pads on paper, it's going to take it a little while to dry. So it's a little bit like the Versamark. Because it takes it longer to dry, you can then add embossing powder to it. And that's probably the main reason people would use a craft ink, is so that they can emboss with it. And that's the reason I have some of the Stampin' Up! Craft inks. This particular color has been discontinued, but they have lots of other colors in their craft ink. So they're great. If you really like embossing, you might want to consider a pigment ink. And you can get those at Stampin' Up! Colorbox also makes some great pigment inks, and they're labeled pigment ink on them. All right. Now, a couple of other different types of ink that you'll have. Chalk inks made by Colorbox. I think Hero Arts. There are some others that make chalk inks. Fluid chalk inks dry immediately. When the ink hits the paper, it's dry. But I have found very, very few stamps that don't work well with this. I mean, this works great with every type of stamp. The other inks that we have here, there are some types of acrylic stamps or rubber stamps that don't seem to pick up as well on some of these different kinds of inks, and you just have to experiment with different ones. It's hard to give you a list and say this particular kind of stamp will work with this particular kind of ink. But the chalk inks work with pretty much everything. Sometimes they do stain the stamps, and that's not a big deal to me. It doesn't impair the quality of the stamp, but and its future use. But these are great products. They're a little bit harder to find, the chalk inks, but I really like those. Now, you cannot do any of that distressing kind of thing, mixing them with water and stuff. They don't work that way, but they're great for stamping. Now, deciding what colors to get in inks. As I said, you'll probably want a black. You'll probably want some basic Distress inks to give some age to your papers. That's a great way to finish off the papers. But when it comes to red and blue and yellow and all the different colors, how do you know which ones to get? Well, one of the ways you can do this without buying full-size ink pads is to buy stamping spots or cubes or what's called a cat's eye. It just depends on the brand. Both Paper Tray Ink, which is available online, and I'll have a link for that on my blog, and Stampin' Up! Offer these cube-size inks. With paper tray ink, you can buy any individual color they have in one cube, and they were $2 a piece. I haven't checked in a price in a while, but that's a way to try out a color. It's cheaper than an ink pad. With Stampin' Up, you buy them in sets. This is an older set. They now come 10 colors to the set, but it's the same size cubes, and it's $20-some. Depends on whether you get the classic or the craft. It varies a little bit in price for the cubes. It's a great way to get a lot of colors pretty cheap. The drawback to them, besides the fact that they're small, it's going to take you a little while longer to ink up a large image. The other drawback is that they dry out a little faster, and sometimes even when you get a whole set, you may have one that's pretty dry in there. And this is where I made a little bit of a mistake when I was buying mine. I started out wanting to get all the colors from Stampin' Up, and I bought all the stamping spots, and that was a good choice because they lasted a long time. Where I made my mistake is when something like Bashful Blue ran out and got too dry to use, I bought a refill for this when I really needed to just go ahead and buy the full-size ink pad. And I did eventually buy the full-size ink pad. If you're using a small spot and you're running out of ink after you've used it for a while, that's a good indicator that that's a color you're going to use. So it's time to go ahead and invest up in the full-size ink pads. So it's not that the refills weren't useful to me later on, but I really just needed to go ahead and buy the full-size ink pads. So if you buy the cubes, you can, eventually you'll want to maybe go into the full-size ink pads, but these lasted me a long time before I had to buy full-size ink pads. The other version of these is Colorbox makes these cat's eye ones in some of their pigment inks and in their fluid chalk inks, and these are another way to test out different colors and see what you're going to like before you buy. Okay, so that's a little tour of inks. Again, what I would recommend is Jet Black and Stays On. I think Memento makes an ink like this that you can use for just regular, anything you want to stamp in black or to color in an image. Some Versamark and some of the Distress inks or the Stampin' Up! Classic that you can use to ink the edges of your papers as well as doing some stamping are a good way to get you started. And then if you want some color, you might want to try some of the smaller colors. Unless you know immediately what colors you're going to be drawn to, you might want to start with some of the smaller stamping spots. So those are some ways to get going in this without buying tons of ink at $5 or $6 an ink pad. You can save some money doing things the other way. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to bringing you some other videos in the Scrapbooker to Cardmaker series.